The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap is about as cute and charming as Zelda adventures come, but don't let its warm, friendly, and whimsical nature fool you. Despite its reputation as one of the easier games in the franchise, this now 20-year-old Game Boy Advance classic will still test your skills and abilities across 6 memorable dungeons. Featuring a host of unique items that shape each dungeon you tackle, Minish Cap's dungeons are all engaging and unique, and arguably integrate their game's central gimmick better than any other Zelda title does. It's why today I want to examine and compare each one to figure out their strengths and weaknesses, and ultimately decide which Minish Cap dungeon is best and which is worst. So without further delay, let's get started, and welcome to every Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap dungeon ranked. As passionate and loyal as the Zelda fanbase is, it still surprises me how many fans of the 3D titles haven't played and don't plan to try the 2D entries in the series. The general aversion to 2D games that many people have is really the only reason why the Minish Cap isn't a lock as my go-to recommendation for fans looking for a place to start playing Zelda games. Otherwise, it's hard for me to deny how great the beginning of Minish Cap is, due in large part to its first dungeon, Deepwood Shrine. Of course, there are other factors that make me feel so strongly about Minish Cap's intro, but I truly think Deepwood Shrine is one of, if not the best opening dungeon in the series. Deepwood Shrine does a fantastic job of hooking you in by making you feel like you're always making progress. You are constantly discovering something useful or significant, whether it be a key or the dungeon item, which makes it feel like every room you enter holds something worth your time. These discoverables wind up serving as breadcrumbs that will lead the player right to the boss chamber door, and Deepwood Shrine has great pacing because of this design choice. However, where Minish Cap's first dungeon truly impresses is in its willingness to test the player's spatial awareness, even if there is some hand-holding from your companion Eslo from time to time. The barrel gimmick found in the dungeon's central room is worth highlighting because it cleverly gets you to start constructing a mental map of Deepwood Shrine in your head. After burning its supports, the barrel can be spun to expose different pathways you can take throughout the trial, which helps the barrel serve as a central point in the dungeon in which you can orient yourself around. It's a very intuitive design that isn't overwhelming, yet prepares you for the type of thinking that will be required in the future when the trials become more difficult. At the same time, the barrel beautifully showcases the core mechanic of shrinking down to Minish size that the game is built around, and gives you a taste of the interesting ideas that will be possible when exploring spaces in such a small state. Almost immediately, we see one of these concepts explored towards the end of Deepwood Shrine when we encounter a green choo-choo that serves as the dungeon boss. These relatively harmless enemies at regular size transform into giant, foreboding monsters when Minish-sized, and further highlight the novelty of exploring as a pint-sized Link. Even though it is not the most interesting fight, the spectacle of it the first time around was very impressive, and one of the biggest reasons I was sold on the Minish Cap is I wanted to see how they would further explore this idea. Unfortunately, I'm a little sad to report that the developers didn't do as much with this concept as I would have liked, because along with a very daunting music track, the choo-choo fight did a lot to drive home the dangers of a world at Minish size. Coming from the cheerful, happy-go-lucky vibes of the Minish village makes Deepwood Shrine seem almost scary by comparison, but it really is anything but scary. Despite some choice in how you complete your tasks, Deepwood Shrine is quite easy and straightforward, and for that reason I don't feel like it deserves to be ranked any higher than I have it. This is a dungeon that heavily relies on the magic of experiencing the world of the Minish for the first time, as its puzzles never really get that complex. And while I enjoy using the Gust Jar at times, and think it's a unique item that they utilize in some interesting ways, I find the solutions to the puzzles designed around it pretty obvious. Still, somehow earning the Earth element feels like you're accomplishing a monumental task, and it's why, in spite of its tutorial-esque nature at times, I consider Deepwood Shrine to be a solid first entry in the Minish Cap's lineup of dungeons. The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap has a remarkably high floor for the quality of its dungeons, and the Fortress of Wind's low ranking here should be all the evidence you need to know that that statement is true. We'll of course get into the flaws that dropped this trial into 5th place, but I wanted to first praise this dungeon for its combat. Even though it doesn't have the best overall combat of Minish Cap's dungeons, I felt a noticeable step up in both the number of enemies and their difficulty in comparison to Deepwood Shrine and the Cave of Flames. Immediately, the mini-boss fight against the Silver Darknut comes to mind, as it's arguably the hardest fight up to that point in the game, but rooms where you are ambushed by 4 Stalfos at once really exemplify what I'm talking about as well. This added aggression and difficulty gave the dungeon a more dangerous feel to it, and ultimately added some welcome volatility to the Fortress of Winds that the previous 2 trials somewhat lacked to me. Aside from its combat, Minish Cap's 3rd dungeon has some pretty solid design centered around its dungeon item, the Mole Mitts. There will be several points in the dungeon where your progress is blocked by unclearable dirt, and it feels very satisfying to go back to these spots and clear the paths that once stopped you. While admittedly not my favorite of this game's dungeon items, it is very satisfying to use these mitts, and I often find myself having to hold back from clearing out every piece of dirt in a room. And while that might sound weird or unnecessary to do, I feel compelled to do this because you are often rewarded with rupees, kinstones, or mysterious shells which will be useful on 100% playthroughs. There's also one particular puzzle I felt was worth highlighting, and it revolves around a key you must obtain to unlock access to the Fortress of Winds Big Key. You'll eventually come across a room with a few wall masters, and defeating them unveils a Minish portal that will lead you to a blocked path if you use it right away. Instead, you're supposed to solve the puzzle in the next room with regular Link to get a key for a locked door that you can then pass through later as Minish Link. This will lead you to a small hole in the next room that Minish Link can squeeze through to find another key that will eventually grant access to the dungeon's big key. It seems pretty straightforward, but it is easy to get lost at this point if you don't immediately backtrack to the Minish portal you summoned earlier, as it's easy to get distracted with the new options presented to you. If you haven't done so already, you could rush off to fight the Silver Darknut mini-boss we discussed earlier, or you could simply get confused by the wall masters and the next Minish portal you find and completely forget about backtracking to transform. While getting lost can be frustrating and off-putting to some, I think that's where the magic comes from in Zelda dungeons. The complexity or illusion of complexity found in these trials are important because they create the mood and atmosphere that makes completing dungeons feel so rewarding. Whether it's the relief that comes from finally figuring out a puzzle, or the satisfaction of solving it right away, it always feels good to be able to progress to the next section of the trial you're in, and it's why this key puzzle from the Fortress of Winds stands out to me. However, as much as I enjoy this specific puzzle, the Fortress of Winds is still my second least favorite Minish Cap dungeon, mainly due to its theming and aesthetics. A huge part of the Minish Cap's appeal for me is in its art style and unique sound, and the Fortress of Winds disappoints on both fronts. I can appreciate that this area is supposed to serve as the ruins of a previous civilization, but I still find the look of the Minish Cap's 3rd dungeon somewhat dull and forgettable. The spaces are cramped and ugly looking to me, with a very repetitive and honestly kind of annoying music track to boot. It's simply not a space I like exploring all that much, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't somewhat disappointed with this dungeon on my first playthrough. While I'm always happy to unlock fast travel with the Ocarina of Wind, I was let down when I realized I wasn't getting a new element or sword upgrade, and while not the trial's biggest issue, it certainly factors into why I've ranked it second to last. Overall, the Fortress of Winds is still an enjoyable dungeon and shouldn't be looked at as bad by any means, despite its low placement on this list. When I think of The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap, among the first things that come to mind are all the fun and unique special items you can acquire along your journey. Not only do many franchise staples return here, like the boomerang and the bow and arrow, but a slew of new items and upgrades for these classics were introduced as well. We saw the debut of remote bombs here 13 years before they appeared in Breath of the Wild, as well as the Gust Jar we touched on earlier. But of all the tools in Link's arsenal in the Minish Cap, the Cane of Pachi found in the Cave of Flames is definitely my favorite. This cane shoots a magic spell in front of Link that primarily flips things upside down, but has various effects depending on what the beam hits. It makes certain enemies, like the shelled spike beetles, vulnerable to attack, while simply disorienting others. When fired into a hole in the ground, it gives Link an extra boost as he pops out that allows him to reach ledges he otherwise couldn't reach, and it can also be used to destroy objects like pots from afar, in addition to its ability to flip various objects over. While many of the uses of this item are obvious, at least within the Cave of Flames itself, I don't mind because I love it when Link gets to cast spells in a Zelda game. It makes Link feel even more versatile as an adventurer than he already is, which is something the Cave of Flames does a great job at showcasing. Whether you are racing between rooms via the cart system, gliding over lava pools with the help of Ezlo and some updrafts, or battling a giant fire-breathing monster to earn the fire element, the Cave of Flames really highlights how badass Link truly is. While the Minish Cap doesn't delve into the wisdom, power, and courage dynamic that most Zelda titles do, few dungeons display Link's courageous side as well as the Cave of Flame does, and the sense of adventure felt here contributes to why I've ranked it above Deepwood Shrine and the Fortress of Winds. I'm also quite fond of the aesthetics found in Minish Cap's second dungeon, even if we are in a fairly generic fire-themed dungeon. The Cave of Flames has always popped to me thanks to Minish Cap's gorgeous art style, and I love how they chose to convey the intense heat in the rooms with lava in them by overlaying a steam filter. I also appreciate things like how Link holds on for dear life when riding the minecarts, or how Link goes into a cartoon-like panic when set on fire, and think the attention to detail goes a long way in creating the mood and atmosphere that makes the Cave of Flames so memorable to me. And while the music track is somewhat forgettable, it is fitting for this area and helps to maintain the dungeon's intensity even in the duller moments. My only complaints with the Cave of Flames lie in its dungeon design, which is admittedly pretty straightforward. You won't really have to worry about creating a mental map in this dungeon as it rarely tests your spatial awareness, but that's honestly okay. Even if my preference for Zelda dungeons leans towards the ones that require you to understand the layout of the area you're exploring, as we've discussed in previous ranking videos, that is not the only way to design a successful Zelda dungeon. The Shadow Temple from Ocarina of Time and the Temple of Time from Twilight Princess are two examples of dungeons that excel more for their set pieces, atmosphere, and aesthetics than the design of the dungeon itself, and I'd say the Cave of Flames falls into that category. And while that does unfortunately hold it back from being ranked any higher on this list, it is still a dungeon worthy of praise for the way that it keeps the flow of Minish Cap's story going at a comfortable pace, while serving as a nice palate cleanse between Deepwood Shrine and the Fortress of Wind's more traditional approach. I'm a big fan of whenever a Zelda dungeon decides to mess with the formula that most Zelda dungeons follow. Most of the time, getting a big key will be the last step in a Zelda dungeon before you gain the ability to fight the boss, and you'll almost always find the dungeon map, compass, and dungeon items beforehand. In the case of the Temple of Droplets, you very quickly come across the big key, and it's shocking because you're not expecting the fourth dungeon to be so short when you arrive to the boss door. However, while you do discover the boss in the next room, there is no fight because the beast, along with the water element beside it, are frozen in ice. Instead, the dungeon progresses like normal as you find a way to unthaw the water element you came for, as well as the giant Octorok that will serve as the boss fight. I think it's a really unique way to subvert your expectations about the structure of a dungeon, because it isn't often that the prize of a temple is located so quickly. The fact that the design of the dungeon has you loop back to this room multiple times reinforces what you're really here to do, and also builds tension for the forthcoming fight with the giant Octorok. City in the Sky from Twilight Princess does something similar with its boss, but it's not often that you see a boss prior to your fight with it, and I really like the presentation of a looming threat that you know you're going to have to deal with eventually. Speaking of the Temple of Droplets presentation, this would be my personal top pick for the dungeon with the best atmosphere and aesthetics in the Minish Cap. I find it so easy to get immersed in this dungeon, and love the idea that even something as trivial as an ice block could serve as a massive fortified dungeon for the Minish. The music here is also among the best that the Minish Cap has to offer, and really complements the environment by nailing the vibe of a harsh, cold winter atmosphere as well as any snow or ice themed level in any game that I've ever played. But for as much as I love the presentation of the Temple of Droplets, there are a few key things that hold it back from a top 2 spot on this list. Combat in the Temple of Droplets was largely underwhelming across the board, though I did enjoy the battles against the Scissors Beetles. Otherwise, reusing the boss and mini-boss from Deepwood Shrine felt a bit lazy, especially when little to nothing was changed about either fight. The regular enemies are also not very interesting or unique, and oftentimes feel more like annoyances meant to distract you from puzzle solving more than actual threats you should pay attention to. And while true that I find the fight against the giant Octorok pretty fun, it still winds up being among the bottom half of this game's dungeon's bosses for me. My other big issue with the Minish Cap's 4th dungeon is the lantern, which is frankly one of my least favorite Zelda items. I've never really enjoyed this tool in any of the Zelda games it's appeared in, and feel like the puzzles designed around it are extremely obvious most of the time. Walk into a dark room? Guess I better pull out my lantern so I can find the way. Located an unlit torch? Better light it up to see if anything good happens. Come across a large chunk of ice? Better melt it to clear the path and retrieve what was inside. I do enjoy being able to one-shot certain enemies with it later in the game, and I do enjoy the puzzle where you must light every torch in a room quickly, but overall the lantern is disappointing as a dungeon item. It feels like a hindrance because it occupies one of your 2 item slots when you could be using something more useful, but of course it's not enough to tank the Temple of Droplets placement any further. As the 4th dungeon in the Minish Cap, the Temple of Droplets is admittedly not the most complex, but if there's one thing I've determined since starting this Zelda dungeon ranking journey, it is that a dungeon can be somewhat on the simple side as long as its other qualities are excellent. And as far as I'm concerned, the Temple of Droplets' music, theming, and overall presentation is about as good as it gets, which is why I've placed it in the top half of the Minish Cap's dungeons. The most memorable dungeon in The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap has always been the Palace of Winds to me. While it may not be the most complex dungeon in terms of puzzle solving, I think it is one of the most fun dungeons to play thanks to its dungeon item, the Rocks Cape. While not the only game to give Link a jump, the use of the Rocks Cape in the Palace of Winds is prominent, creating a dungeon with a surprising focus on platforming. Some of my favorite moments in this trial come from jumping into wind currents to cross huge bottomless pits, or climbing clouds high into the sky so you have enough height to jump off of and glide to where you need to go next. It's somewhat unfortunate that we don't have the ability to learn the downward strike from Swift Blade until after we've completed the Palace of Winds, unless you really want to backtrack in the middle of the dungeon, because I can only imagine how many other cool ideas centered around the Rocks Cape could have been implemented. That said, it's already neat that you can jump off the palace into updrafts, seamlessly transition from level to level with panels, and leap over enemies and obstacles. However, in my eyes, the best use of the Rocks Cape comes in the boss fight against the Georg pair because of how it contributes to the spectacle of the battle. It's already fairly badass that you're riding on the backs of these monsters extremely high up in the sky, but the fact that you are front flipping between the two so they can each get a taste of Link's sword makes this an iconic Zelda boss fight. Visually, this dungeon is very generic looking, but it gets away with it thanks to the setting and incredible music track. Knowing that this palace is a sacred place high above the clouds helps compensate for the lack of imagination in the dungeon's aesthetics, but the music is what really sells the gravity and importance of this trial. The Palace of Winds music track is easily my favorite dungeon theme in the Minish Cap, and it may very well be my favorite music track for a dungeon in the entire Zelda franchise as well. It's such a dynamic song with a tone shift about a minute in that transforms the atmosphere of the dungeon from that of wonder and awe to something much more serious, focused, and heroic. It's a tremendous track that I can't praise enough, and one that does a lot of heavy lifting for the Palace of Winds' personality and vibe. From a combat point of view, Minish Cap's 5th dungeon also excels by continuing to increase the challenge and variety of enemies you can encounter. The Wizrobe fights to unlock the Rocks Cape, and the battle against the Dark Nut guarding the path indoors both stand out to me in addition to the Georg pair as fun, engaging fights in the Palace of Winds. Perhaps it is just the Zelda fan in me, but I just really enjoy seeing so many classic enemies from the franchise represented here, as we have Gibdos, Moblins, Peahats, Keese, Stalfos, Wizrobes, Choo-Choos, and a Ball and Chain Soldier all present in the Palace of Winds. Having so many different enemies is exciting because it prevents you from shutting off your brain by forcing you to mix up your approach to combat, and it's something about Minish Cap's penultimate dungeon that I appreciate. Lastly, I want to talk about how much I enjoy that the dungeon is split into 2 distinct sections for the way it continues to sell the lengths the Wind Tribe were willing to go in order to protect the wind element. Considering how high you are in the sky, you feel like you're infiltrating a sacred place no human should be when traversing the outside portion, and the inside feels even more dangerous with the density of enemies and traps in each room. I find it so easy to get immersed in this dungeon as a result, and it's a big reason why I consider this to be among the short list of S-tier Zelda dungeons. Of course, this is not a perfect dungeon, and if presentation means little to you in comparison to dungeon design that challenges your spatial awareness, you may be left desiring a little more. But for me, the memorable fights, incredible music, heroic atmosphere, and unique focus on platforming make up for the easier, more linear design, and why it was so very difficult to not place at number 1 on this ranking. I think something most Zelda fans can agree on is that it is nice when Ganondorf isn't the final boss of a game every once in a while. I think that's a small part of what makes replaying the Minish Cap so appealing, because Vaati is still a breath of fresh air to this day thanks to his incredibly memorable and genuinely challenging fight. It's great to see a character that's presented as a big threat for the entire game actually back it up in the final showdown, and each of Vaati's 3 forms can do some serious damage. Everything about this final boss battle works for me, from the multiple phases, to the tower crumble sequence, to the aftermath when Vaati is ultimately defeated, and it's easily my favorite fight in the game. A close second actually occurs directly before the final boss, as well as a bit earlier in the dungeon as you do battle with 2 different Black Knights. These fights are extremely fun because you have to work really hard for every opening you get to deal damage to these foes. Their defense is the best of any enemy in the game, and they can also deal massive damage, requiring you to play smart and come up with a viable strategy. Needless to say, these fights are my favorite mini-bosses in The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap, and a big part of why I love Dark Hyrule Castle. There's really no question in my mind that combat peaked in Minish Cap's final dungeon, as it rightfully should have, because in addition to several other very fun Dark Knight battles, there is by far the most enemy variety of any of this game's dungeons. These many Dark Knight fights are notable as well for how they represent choice within Dark Hyrule Castle, as you can take them on in any order you would like. While they must all be defeated to earn keys you need to progress, it's nice to feel a sense of freedom for a bit as you roam the castle, exploring in whichever direction you'd like. Unfortunately, while you're traversing the dungeon, you won't encounter any pieces of heart, nor will you find a new dungeon item, making this the only dungeon without one in the game. Even so, I think they did a good job at repurposing and expanding on an area we were already familiar with, and there are many memorable rooms in Dark Hyrule Castle that don't revolve around combat. Aesthetically, Dark Hyrule Castle is second only to the Temple of Droplets when it comes to Minish Cap's dungeons, though I might be a little biased as it heavily uses a purple and green color scheme, which are 2 of my favorite colors. Rooms like the one where we duel the Ball and Chain Soldier stand out in my mind for being so beautifully designed that it elevates the fight through how cinematic its setting feels. I also believe the remix of the Hyrule Castle theme is one of the best remixes of that song in the Zelda franchise, and think it sets the perfect ominous mood for the end of the game. Its slow pace and dark tones drive home the inevitability of the conflict to come, and I love the tension it creates throughout the dungeon. It's truly difficult for me to find faults with this final dungeon, and I believe it exemplifies the best of what the Minish Cap has to offer. There's a good mix of different kinds of puzzles, including some designed around using 4 separate links at once. Ezlo is the least overbearing he's been throughout the entire game, allowing you to solve most of the dungeon's puzzles by yourself. And the ending is satisfying and conclusive, while being a bit sad and leaving you wanting more, which is how any good piece of media should make you feel. It is absolutely an S-tier Zelda dungeon in my eyes, and my pick as the Minish Cap's best dungeon. If you talk to almost any fan of The Legend of Zelda the Minish Cap, they will probably tell you it is one of the most underrated Zelda games in the franchise, and that's in large part due to the 6 quality dungeons we just discussed. Each one has something interesting or special worth checking out, and if you're yearning for more of the classic Zelda formula, you won't be disappointed with this GBA classic. But please let me know what you thought of my ranking down below. Did you agree with my list, or would you have ranked the Minish Cap's dungeons differently? Drop your ranking in a comment, and as always, be sure to like the video and subscribe if you enjoyed this content and would like to be alerted whenever I release a new video. Thanks for watching.